Why would a man who spent his entire life in front of the cameras, who built his name on transparency, on justice, on storytelling, suddenly demand silence? No flight logs, no co-pilot, no radio communications saved, no trace. That's not just unusual, that's alarming. Rob Reiner, a man synonymous with truth in storytelling, a man who exposed injustices on the big screen and called out corruption in real life, asked for his final flight to vanish from history. And then, just days later, he was gone. Brutally, violently, and under circumstances so chilling, even Hollywood's darkest screenwriters couldn't have dreamed it up. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Stabbed, alongside his wife Michelle, in their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. Their own son, Nick Reiner, arrested that very night. And their daughter, Romy, she's the one who found them. But here's the twist that sets this entire case ablaze. Romy told police something no one expected. There's someone in this family who should be a suspect. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Just pointed them inward, toward a family already shattered. And then came the second shockwave, the pilot. Rob's longtime private pilot, a man who'd flown him across continents for over a decade, broke his silence. And what he revealed about Reiner's last flight could rewrite everything we think we know about that weekend. The secrecy, the fear, the cryptic envelope Reiner clutched in his hand, and the final words he spoke before stepping off that plane. But before we get to what the pilot said, before we crack into the eerie silence of that skybound journey, let's ask the real question. Why was Rob Reiner, at 78, terrified of leaving a record? What did he know? What did he suspect? Or what was he planning? Because if there's one thing we've learned from history, it's this. When powerful men go silent, it's never random. When flight logs vanish, it's not a mistake. And when bodies turn up in Brentwood, the story's only just beginning. Now here's where this gets personal. Rob Reiner wasn't just another Hollywood elite. He was the Hollywood elite, son of comedy legend Carl Reiner. He grew up in the heart of showbiz royalty. He lived, breathed, and built his empire through truth-telling, satire, and sharp wit. And even into his later years, he wielded influence like a king. So ask yourself, why would a man who fought for transparency his whole life suddenly vanish behind a curtain of secrecy? Why, on his final flight, did he make sure that no one would be able to trace where he'd been, what he said, or who he was with? And more disturbingly, was he trying to protect someone or expose them? Because here's another layer. The Reiners were already under stress. Insiders whisper of tension between Rob and his son Nick, a once promising screenwriter who spiraled into addiction, arrests, and silence. Romy, the youngest, had distanced herself from the family years ago, only recently reconnecting. Michelle, Rob's wife of over 40 years, was said to be planning a major personal transition, though no one quite knew what that meant. And then, violence. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, just two bodies, multiple stab wounds. The manner of death? Homicide. And what about Nick? He lived in the guest house. He was home. He's the one who allegedly refused to open the door when Romy came knocking. And then the police arrived. Now here's the kicker that few in the media are talking about. Rob Reiner wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a filmmaker. He was connected, deeply, to political circles, to nonprofits, to powerful foundations, and to people who don't like their secrets spilled. One of those foundations? The Clooney Foundation for Justice. And reports have emerged, unconfirmed, but persistent, that in the weeks before his death, Reiner had clashed with associates over an undisclosed matter involving donations, misuse of funds, and what one insider described as a betrayal. So what do we have? A private flight erased from official record, a secretive envelope in Rob's hand, a double murder, a family member arrested, a daughter pointing fingers, and a pilot with a story no one wanted told until now. You'd think this was a script. You'd think this was fiction, but it's not. And the more we unravel, the deeper this rabbit hole goes. We'll take you inside that final flight, minute by minute. We'll examine the forensic evidence from the murder scene. We'll reveal the never-before-seen security footage from the estate's eastern driveway. And most chillingly, we'll hear the words Reiner spoke on the runway. Because once you hear what the pilot heard, you'll realize this wasn't just a flight. This was a warning, and someone, maybe even Rob himself, knew the end was coming. But here's the question no one has dared to ask. Did Rob Reiner orchestrate his own disappearance? No, not a staged death, not a fake exit, but a message, a final cinematic act, one that would speak volumes, if only someone was listening. And now we are. But what the pilot told investigators just 2 days after the murders, that was the moment everything shifted. That's where we're going next. Because his testimony, kept sealed under gag order until now, doesn't just include Reiner's final request. It includes what he saw on that plane, what he heard before takeoff, and what he found after Reiner stepped off the aircraft in silence. And trust me, what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What did the pilot see? And more importantly, what was he afraid to say at first? Because when the gag order lifted, and he finally agreed to sit down with investigators. Not media, not tabloids, but federal agents. What came out wasn't just a report. It was a confession. A confession not from him, but about Rob Reiner. A man who, in the pilot's own words, seemed haunted on that final flight. Not scared, not sick, not senile. Just haunted. His hands shook when he boarded. His eyes barely blinked. He wore a black zip-up hoodie over a white t-shirt. No suit, no assistants, no entourage. Just Rob. Alone. Silent. And in his hand, that envelope. A thick, crumpled, weathered yellow envelope sealed with red wax. The pilot said Reiner clutched it so tightly, his knuckles went pale. And just before the door closed, just before the engines kicked in, Reiner leaned forward, looked his pilot square in the eye, and said, "This flight didn't happen. If you write it down, I'll know." He didn't shout. He didn't whisper. He said it like a line from a movie, rehearsed, intentional, and then he sat back and said nothing for the next hour. Now let me ask you, what kind of man says that? What kind of man, especially one with nothing to hide, makes sure no record exists of his whereabouts? And why, just days later, is he found dead, alongside his wife, in a home with no signs of forced entry? You don't have to be a detective to know something's off here. Even the pilot, a hardened veteran who'd flown celebrities, CEOs, even presidents, admitted, "I had a feeling I was flying him into something he already expected." But maybe it wasn't just dread. Maybe it was a plan. Because that envelope, the one Rob clutched like it contained the Holy Grail, the pilot claims Reiner left it on the seat when he disembarked. Deliberately. Almost like he wanted it found. But when the pilot returned to the cabin after dropping Reiner off, gone. He swears it was there when he turned around. Swears he saw it resting under the seatbelt. And in that brief moment, when he stepped outside to refuel, sign papers, shake hands, it vanished. And when asked who else had access to the plane in that time frame, only one name came up. A man in a dark overcoat, sunglasses, no ID badge. Someone who wasn't on the manifest. Someone the tower never logged. The pilot assumed he was Reiner's assistant. But the Reiners didn't have an assistant that week. In fact, Michelle had reportedly fired their longtime house manager the week before, after accusing her of letting the wrong people in. Letting who in? And why? Because hours later, Rob Reiner was dead. Michelle too. Stabbed. Multiple times. In their own bedroom. But not Nick. Nick was alive. Nick was there. Living in the guest house. Just steps away. And here's the part that turns this from chilling to sinister. Nick refused to answer the door when Romy came knocking that night. She had just flown in from New York. She sensed something was wrong. She hadn't heard from her mother in 2 days. Texts ignored. Calls missed. So she drove straight from LAX to Brentwood. Rang the bell. Rang again. Then called Nick's cell. No answer. She finally climbed the back gate herself and went inside. And what she found? Silence. Total, eerie, blood-soaked silence. 2 bodies. No signs of forced entry. No shattered glass. No broken locks. Just Rob and Michelle. Cold. Pale. Gone. And Nick? He was later found in the guest house. Watching TV. Now here's where the contradiction explodes this whole thing wide open. Police reports say Nick appeared disoriented when they arrived. Slurred speech. Possible drug influence. Maybe shock. Maybe guilt. But Romy told a different story. She told them he was calm. Unbothered. As if he expected them to come. And when asked why he didn't check on his parents, he allegedly replied, "I thought they went out." Out. Rob and Michelle Reiner didn't go out without telling their staff. without security, without their phones, and the kitchen table was still set. A teacup still warm, one chair knocked over. A struggle. But here's what truly sealed the suspicion. When officers asked Nick about the last time he saw his parents alive, he reportedly gave a vague answer. But Romy swears she overheard him say something else to a friend on the phone before the police arrived. A phrase that made her skin crawl. I did what I had to do. Now maybe that meant nothing. Maybe it was about something else entirely. Maybe. But combine that with the pilot's testimony, the envelope, the deleted flight, the missing assistant, that's not coincidence. That's choreography. And what if Rob knew? What if that flight wasn't a panic move, but a trap? What if the silence, the deleted logs, the envelope, all of it was a message? Not to us, not to the public, but to someone close, someone he feared, or someone he loved. Because here's the thing about Rob Reiner. He knew stories. He knew tension, suspense, reveals. He knew that sometimes silence screams louder than words. And maybe, just maybe, his final story wasn't on a screen. It was in the sky. A ghost flight. One last performance. With blood for credits. And it's only just beginning. Because in the next chapter, we're going back. Back to where it all began. To the man behind the curtain. To the legacy. The legend. The cracks behind the smile. And we're going to ask the question no one in Hollywood dared to speak aloud. Was Rob Reiner living a lie? Even to the very end, Rob Reiner wasn't just a director. He was Hollywood's moral compass. Or so we thought. What do you picture when you hear the name Rob Reiner? A warm laugh? A principled speech on democracy? A string of movies that helped define your childhood? To the world, Rob Reiner was a beacon. A Hollywood prince turned political powerhouse. A man who stood up, spoke out, and seemed, above all else, good. But here's the thing about legends. They always cast a shadow. And as we peel back the layers of Reiner's legacy, one fact becomes clearer with every headline, every whisper, every piece of sealed testimony. The story we were told about Rob Reiner may not be the story that ended his life. So let's go back. Before the private flights, before the envelope, before the silence. Let's revisit the man who seemed to have it all and still lost everything. Born into stardom, Rob Reiner didn't just enter Hollywood. He was born into it. His father, Carl Reiner, was a comedic titan, the mind behind The Dick Van Dyke Show, the voice behind decades of laughter. His mother, Estelle, was no stranger to performance either. Remember, I'll have what she's having. That was her. So from the very beginning, Rob was surrounded by cameras, scripts, and fame. He was raised in Beverly Hills, went to the same schools as other industry royalty, and learned quickly that in Hollywood, perception was everything. But Rob wasn't just a privileged kid on studio lots. He was smart, politically aware, deeply observant, and by the time he broke through with his iconic role as Meathead on All in the Family, audiences knew this wasn't just another celebrity's son coasting on connections. He had something to say, the voice of a generation. In the 1980s and 90s, Rob Reiner became more than just an actor. He was a force behind the camera. Let's just roll through this lineup. This is Spinal Tap, 1984. A mockumentary masterpiece. Stand By Me, 1986, a poignant look at youth and mortality. The Princess Bride, 1987, an ageless fairy tale laced with sarcasm and sincerity. When Harry Met Sally, 1989, a romantic revolution. A Few Good Men, 1992, You Can't Handle the Truth. You know the line. And this wasn't just success. This was respect. Critics, fans, politicians, they trusted Rob Reiner. Because in his films, the good guy always won. Justice always triumphed. He gave people hope that decency still mattered. And maybe that's what made what happened decades later so hard to accept. The marriage that withstood Hollywood. Rob's marriage to Michelle Singer Reiner was hailed as one of the rare success stories in an industry riddled with breakups and betrayal. They married in 1989. She was a photographer and activist, elegant, soft-spoken, and deeply loyal. Together, they adopted a daughter, Romy, and raised Nick from Rob's previous marriage as their own. Publicly, they were graceful, private, purposeful. They marched at protests together, supported voter rights, donated millions to progressive causes. But behind closed doors, there were cracks. Former family friends, speaking anonymously, described growing distance between Rob and Nick. Fights that got louder. Nights Nick wouldn't come home. Days when Michelle would shut herself in her studio for hours. By 2025, neighbors noticed the couple wasn't appearing together as often. Michelle was rarely seen at fundraisers. Rob showed up solo. And at one event, a hot mic caught him muttering, "We're all pretending." That's what families do. Pretending what? That everything was fine, or that something dangerous wasn't bubbling beneath the surface. The son he couldn't save. Nick Reiner. If Rob was the golden boy of Hollywood fathers, Nick was supposed to be the heir. Talented, creative, charismatic, but troubled. From a young age, Nick wrestled with addiction. Rehab stints, relapses, rumors of violent outbursts. Still, Rob kept supporting him, financially, emotionally, legally. He co-wrote Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical film about a young addict struggling to find identity under the weight of a famous father's shadow. Critics called it honest, raw, but those close to the Reiner family say it was more than a movie. It was a cry, because while Rob loved his son, he didn't know how to reach him. He was always trying to fix things, one close family associate said. He'd throw money at problems, pay off people, cover things up. He just couldn't accept that Nick was broken in ways he couldn't control. And that frustration, that desperation, may have led to the unthinkable. The daughter who knew too much. Romy Reiner, their younger child, stayed out of the spotlight for the most part. She dabbled in comedy, tried her hand at writing, but mostly, she distanced herself. Friends say she felt like an outsider, watching a family at war behind glass walls. A silent witness to fights, secrets, and cover-ups. And while she publicly supported her family, privately, she kept receipts, screenshots, voice notes, diaries. And when the murders happened, it wasn't her tears that shocked detectives. It was her clarity. She came in calm, said one investigator. Like she'd been expecting this. And she didn't hesitate. She gave us names, timelines, motives. And one chilling quote. "My father was afraid of someone in this family. And I think I know who." Hollywood's quiet panic. The day the news broke, Rob Reiner and wife stabbed to death, Hollywood froze. Not just in grief, but in fear. Because Rob wasn't just a director. He was connected. To donors. To political figures. To foundations with layers of financial shielding. He sat on boards. He advised presidential campaigns. He knew secrets. And when a man like that ends up dead, questions multiply like wildfire. Was it personal? Was it a mental breakdown? Or was there something bigger? Back to the beginning. The truth is, for all his charisma and talent, Rob Reiner had enemies. Quiet ones, powerful ones, and maybe even ones in his own home. He was a father trying to protect a broken family. A filmmaker trying to control a real-life plot spiraling beyond the page. A husband trying to hold on to a woman he feared was slipping away. And in the final months of his life, sources say Rob began pulling away. He stopped answering certain calls. He cut ties with 2 old friends. He told a colleague, "If anything happens to me, don't believe the first story." Now let that sink in. He knew. And when he boarded that final flight, no logs, no trace. He wasn't just running. He was writing his final act. The question is, who was it for? Was he trying to protect someone? Expose someone? Or was he making peace with the inevitable? We don't know yet. But what we do know is that it all starts with that flight. And the pilot who refused to stay quiet any longer. Because what he saw, what he heard, before, during, and after that flight, it didn't just contradict everything the public thought they knew about Rob Reiner. It suggested something darker, something deliberate, and something that could tear the entire Reiner family story to pieces. Up next, the man in the cockpit. And the instructions that should have never been spoken, but what the pilot didn't say publicly until now, changes everything. What kind of passenger tells his pilot to erase a flight before the wheels even leave the ground? Not request it, not hint at it, demand it, and then sit back like the decision has already been made. Because that's exactly how the pilot described it when he finally spoke. And when he did, the room went quiet. The pilot had flown Rob Reiner for years. Not once, not twice, hundreds of times. Private aviation is built on trust, on routine, on habit. Celebrities come and go, but the rules don't change. There are logs. There are co-pilots. There are tower recordings. There is always a paper trail. Always. Until that morning. The pilot remembers it because it felt wrong from the first phone call. Not urgent. Not panicked, just deliberate. Rob wanted a short flight. No assistance. No family. No press. And then came the line that made the pilot pause. Just you, Rob said. No records, he added. And I don't want anyone else on the channel. At first, the pilot thought it was a joke. Celebrities sometimes exaggerate. They like to feel in control. But Rob didn't laugh. He waited. And when the pilot asked what he meant by no records, Rob clarified. No flight logs filed that day. No co-pilot listed. No archive tower communication. No digital footprint. That's not privacy. That's erasure. The pilot pushed back. Gently. Professionally. He explained regulations. Procedures. Liability. He even tried humor. Rob didn't smile. Instead, he leaned forward and said something the pilot would later repeat verbatim to investigators. I don't need this flight to exist. Let that sink in. Not, I want privacy. Not, I don't want attention. But, I don't need this flight to exist. So the pilot did something he says he regrets every day. He agreed. The morning of the flight was quiet. Too quiet. No paparazzi. No assistants pacing the tarmac. No frantic phone calls. Just Rob Reiner, standing alone near the aircraft, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground like a man rehearsing bad news. The pilot noticed Rob looked thinner. Older. Not frail, but worn. His eyes were red, like he hadn't slept. And then there was the envelope. Thick. Yellowed. Sealed. Rob carried it like it weighed more than the rest of his luggage combined. He didn't hand it off. Didn't place it in a bag. He kept it on his lap during boarding. As the engines warmed, the pilot ran through the checklist. Rob said nothing. No jokes. No commentary about politics. No small talk. Just silence. 10 minutes into the flight, the pilot tried to break it. Everything okay back there? Rob didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm. Too calm. I've made a lot of movies about truth, he said. Turns out, truth doesn't always want to be filmed. Then silence again. No explanation. No follow-up. The pilot later said that was the moment he realized this flight wasn't about where they were going. It was about what Rob was leaving behind. Halfway through the flight, something happened that still bothers the pilot. Rob stood up. No warning. No turbulence. Just stood. He walked to the cockpit doorway and rested his hand on the frame. And then he asked a question that made no sense at the time. If someone wanted to disappear, Rob said, what's the one thing you'd tell them not to forget? The pilot hesitated. That wasn't a casual question. That was a loaded one. He gave a generic answer. Paperwork. Witnesses. Money trails. Rob nodded, then said, exactly, and returned to his seat. Ask yourself something. If you were planning a vacation, would you ask that? If you were stressed, would you ask that? If you were sick or depressed, would you ask that? Or would you only ask that if you believed disappearance was no longer hypothetical? The landing was uneventful. But what happened on the ground wasn't. As soon as the plane stopped, Rob didn't wait for instructions. He unbuckled, stood, and headed for the door. Before exiting, he turned back. He looked the pilot straight in the eyes and said the sentence that would later make investigators stop taking notes. If anything comes back to you, Rob said, remember, you never saw me today. Then he stepped off the plane. No goodbye, no thank you, no smile, just gone. The pilot stayed seated for a moment, unsettled. Something told him not to move. When he finally stood and walked back into the cabin, he noticed something immediately. The envelope was still there, on the seat, untouched. The pilot stared at it. He didn't open it. He didn't touch it. He knew better. He walked back toward the cockpit to log the landing manually. That's when the interruption happened. A man approached the plane. Dark coat. Sunglasses. No visible badge. Not ground crew. Not security. Not familiar. The man nodded once and asked, is Mr. Reiner finished? The pilot said yes. The man stepped up the stairs. And that's the last moment the pilot remembers clearly. Because when he returned to the cabin moments later, the envelope was gone. No explanation. No record. No witness. Just absence. 2 days later, the pilot turned on the television and saw Rob Reiner's face staring back at him. Dead. Alongside his wife. Stabbed. Homicide. The pilot said his stomach dropped. Not because of shock, but because of recognition. He recognized the feeling. The tension. The silence. The finality. It all clicked. That flight wasn't random. It was preparatory. So when investigators contacted him, he didn't answer right away. He waited. He watched the story unfold. The son arrested. The daughter's statement. The whispers of family tension. And then the call came again. This time, from federal agents. They didn't ask about the flight destination. They asked about the logs. Or rather, the lack of them. They asked about the envelope. They asked about the man in the dark coat. They asked if Rob ever seemed afraid. The pilot paused and said something that shifted the entire investigation. He wasn't afraid, he said. He was resolved. Resolved to what? That's the question. Because people who are afraid panic. People who are guilty hide. But people who are resolved, they prepare. They clean up loose ends. They erase trails. They leave messages where they know they'll be found or stolen. And they make sure certain flights never officially happen. Which brings us to the most disturbing part of the pilot's testimony. Something he didn't mention at first. Something he remembered only after replaying the day in his head for hours. As Rob stepped off the plane, he whispered something. Not to the pilot. To himself. A single sentence. The pilot didn't hear it clearly at first. But later, he was sure. Rob Reiner said, "They won't be able to say I didn't try." Try what? To warn someone? To fix something? To stop someone? Or to protect them? That sentence alone reframes everything. Because it suggests Rob knew something was coming. Not hoped. Not feared. Knew. And if that's true, then the murders at the Brentwood estate weren't spontaneous. They were the final chapter of a story Rob had already begun writing. But here's where it gets even darker. Because when investigators checked surveillance near the landing site, they found something odd. A vehicle, parked just out of camera range, registered to a shell company. One that traces back, not to Nick, not to Romy, but to a trust Rob had quietly restructured weeks before his death. Why would Rob change his financial structure right before demanding an erased flight? Why would someone else remove that envelope? And why would Rob whisper about trying, if the worst was already inevitable? Those answers don't live in the sky. They live back on the ground. Inside the Reiner home. Inside the family. Inside the relationships that were quietly collapsing long before the knives came out. Because the next thing investigators uncovered didn't come from aviation records. It came from inside the house. A message, left behind. One that suggests Rob Reiner wasn't just flying away from something. He was flying toward the truth. And someone didn't want him to land with it. But what police found inside the Brentwood estate, hidden in plain sight, would turn suspicion into certainty. What happens when a flight vanishes from the record, not in the clouds, but on the ground? Because this wasn't a crash. There were no search parties. No mayday calls. No wreckage. The plane landed. Rob Reiner stepped off. And still, the flight doesn't exist. Not officially. Not digitally. Not even on paper. And that silence, more than the blood, more than the whispers, is what terrified investigators most. Because once you understand how aviation logging works, you'll understand just how hard someone had to try to make that flight disappear. And why? Let's talk about paper trails. Every flight leaves a fingerprint. Not just one. Dozens. When a plane leaves the tarmac, it triggers a chain reaction across systems. Filed flight plan, origin, destination, alternate routes. Pilot manifest, crew, passengers. Tower recordings. Every word between air traffic control and cockpit. Maintenance logs, pre- and post-flight checks. GPS tracking and transponder pings. Fuel receipts. Tarmac surveillance. Hangar access logs. Now imagine trying to erase all of that. That's not privacy. That's surgical. And in Rob Reiner's case, it was nearly perfect. The search begins. When detectives began piecing together Rob's final 72 hours, they expected the flight data to be the easiest part. Celebrities use private flights all the time. It's discreet, but never invisible. Except this one was. When they contacted the local FAA authority, no record. When they requested tower communication logs, missing. When they asked for hangar check-in records, corrupted. It didn't make sense. Planes don't just appear and vanish. They require clearance, monitoring, scheduling. And yet, Rob Reiner's final flight had fewer traces than a food delivery. So the question became, who could erase a flight that thoroughly? And more urgently, why? The envelope reappears, sort of. Remember that yellow envelope? The one the pilot said was left behind? For 48 hours, investigators believed it was gone. Vanished. Possibly stolen. Then something strange happened. A small manila envelope, unmarked, unsealed, was anonymously dropped into a secured mailbox at a private hangar in Santa Monica. Inside, a single printed document. No fingerprints. No DNA. No handwritten markings. Just one flight plan. The date matched Rob's final journey, but everything else. Fake. Wrong airport code. Incorrect aircraft number. Bogus signature from a retired controller. In other words, a forgery, but one that required insider access to format so precisely. You can't fake this kind of thing from Google. You need access to systems, formats, templates. This wasn't a cover-up by amateurs. This was someone trained. And that changed the stakes, fast. The FAA stonewalls. As the media frenzy around the Reiner murders grew, the FAA suddenly went quiet. No comment. No statements. No press briefings. And when a Freedom of Information Act request was filed for Reiner's last known flight, denied. National security exemption. Let that sink in. Rob Reiner was an actor, a director, a public figure, not a spy, not military, not under investigation. So why would his erased flight be classified under a national security clause? Unless the flight crossed into something bigger, something more sensitive, something someone didn't want tied back to Reiner's death. And that brings us to the man investigators couldn't ignore, the shadow on the tarmac. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man in a black coat and dark sunglasses walking briskly toward the jet just minutes after Reiner exited. No ID, no badge, no luggage. And here's the twist. The pilot assumed he was with Reiner. Airport staff assumed he was with the pilot. But surveillance footage, what little remained, shows neither. The angle is off. The timestamp is missing. And when questioned, the tower claimed the footage had been accidentally deleted during routine server maintenance. Accidentally. Within 48 hours of a double homicide connected to that very flight, investigators weren't buying it. They issued a request for footage backups. They got a letter instead, from a lawyer, representing the company that owns the airport. Cease and desist. No further inquiries without subpoena. Again, this isn't a random flight. This is Rob Reiner's flight. So again we ask, what was on that plane? Who wanted it erased? And what did Reiner know before he took off? Private aviation experts step in. Detectives, broad and specialists, former FAA officials, private security consultants, and aviation forensics analysts. Their verdict? This kind of deletion takes preparation. Days, if not weeks. So let's back up. If Rob requested a vanishing flight, he had to have known how hard it would be to make it vanish. Which means, he either had help from someone on the inside, was forced into it by someone who did, or he'd been planning it for longer than anyone realized. All three options point to one thing: premeditation, and not just of a flight, but of an exit. Financial trail, the rewired trust. Around the same time as the flight, Rob Reiner made a subtle change to his family trust. Public records show that just 10 days before his death, Reiner altered beneficiary clauses. Nothing major on paper, but significant when cross-referenced with private insurance documentation, specifically the flight's insurance clause. Previously, all flights were under standard liability coverage. After the change, an exemption added for non-log travel. In other words, if Rob died under suspicious conditions during an unlogged flight, the payout would be doubled. Why? Why would he make that change? Why increase a payout for exactly the scenario that killed him? Unless he saw it coming. Unless the flight was bait or a test, and whoever took the envelope failed it. The message hidden in absence. Here's the theory investigators began floating, but never confirmed on record. What if Rob knew someone in his circle wanted him silenced? What if that person was watching his every move? What if Rob deliberately staged a vanishing flight? No logs, no traces. Not to escape, but to see who would follow the trail, to see who would take the bait. And maybe that envelope wasn't meant to be protected. Maybe it was meant to be stolen, so Rob could watch who went after it. If that's true, then Rob wasn't just a victim. He was a player, a storyteller, even in death. And someone underestimated that. What the missing logs really mean. Most people think erasing a flight is about hiding movement, but that's not the real purpose. Erasing a flight erases witnesses. No tower recordings. No timestamp landings. No maintenance workers to testify. No digital paper trail. It creates a vacuum. One where motive can't be traced. Where alibis can't be confirmed. Where timelines can be twisted. And in that vacuum, truth dies. Unless someone, somewhere, kept a backup. And that's where the story takes its next turn. Because while the FAA stonewalled, one man in a different department, one far from the investigation, reached out anonymously. He didn't give a name. He gave something else. A partial audio recording of a plane landing at the exact time of Rob Reiner's final flight. With one line, barely audible, but unmistakably clear. Ground control, this is Echo 6. Reiner is off. Echo 6. An old code used by Reiner's previous pilots. Years ago, long before his current aircraft. Long before this pilot. Which means, someone else was listening. Someone who wasn't supposed to. And if that audio is real, then the flight existed. And someone went to extreme lengths to erase that truth. But here's the twist. That partial recording? It didn't come from the airport. It came from inside the Reiner estate's home server. A backup, which suggests Rob recorded his own landing from home. And that means he knew the logs would be deleted. He knew the cover-up was coming. He just didn't know how fast or how bloody. And what the backup server revealed next would blow the case wide open. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no shattered glass, just blood everywhere, and silence. Because whoever killed Rob and Michelle Reiner didn't just murder them. They knew them. They walked through that door like they belonged there. And when the screams stopped, one person was still on the property. Nick Reiner. Alive. Calm. Watching television in the guest house. So let's break down exactly what happened inside that $13.5 million Brentwood mansion the night Hollywood royalty were wiped off the map. The timeline. A chilling breakdown. 6:04 p.m. Security camera footage from a neighbor's driveway picks up Michelle returning home in her silver SUV. She's alone. 6:15 p.m. Rob Reiner is seen entering through the back gate. Unusual. He always used the front. 6:47 p.m. A loud noise is reported by a neighbor. A scream. Short. High-pitched. Then silence. 7:03 p.m. Outdoor lights flicker. Possibly triggered by the motion detector or power disruption. 7:45 p.m. Romy Reiner arrives. She's early, having flown in from New York on a red-eye. She tries calling her mom. No answer. Calls again. No answer. 7:52 p.m. Romy rings the doorbell. Nothing. 7:56 p.m. Romy calls Nick's phone. No answer. 8:02 p.m. Romy climbs over the side gate, enters through the side patio. 8:05 p.m. Romy finds the bodies. Now let's freeze there. 2 people. Dead. Multiple stab wounds. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. And 1 family member. Silent. Just yards away. The scene itself. A horrific still life. According to the coroner's report, Rob Reiner was found in the hallway leading from the kitchen to the staircase. Face down. His watch was shattered. Blood soaked into the rug beneath him. He had 5 stab wounds. 3 to the torso, 1 to the neck, 1 to the hand, suggesting a last-minute defensive attempt. Michelle was discovered in the master bedroom, on the bed, face up, arms crossed unnaturally over her chest, as if posed. Her cause of death? 7 stab wounds, 2 fatal ones to the heart. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, not even broken glass. But here's what shocked investigators. There was a single cup of tea on the nightstand. Still warm. Michelle had been preparing for bed. Her slippers were by the door. Her reading glasses rested on the pillow. Her tablet, open to a recipe page. Whatever happened, happened fast. And yet, so controlled. Forensics point to familiarity. There were no foreign fingerprints in the house. No boot prints. No broken locks. Nothing out of place, except the bodies. That suggests one thing. The killer was expected. Or at the very least, trusted. And this is where things get disturbing. You'd expect panic. You'd expect overkill. But the wounds were precise. Deliberate. This wasn't a rage killing. This was surgical. Now couple that with the total absence of surveillance from inside the home. Not because there were no cameras, there were. But the system had been wiped. The hard drive in the security server was found melted. Not deleted. Not erased. Melted. Burned using a small butane torch, likely from the garage. You don't bring a torch to a murder unless you planned it. Romy's discovery. Let's return to Romy. She climbed the gate herself. She walked into that house, expecting to see her parents. Instead, She saw blood. She called 911 immediately, but her voice was calm. Too calm. The dispatcher even noted it. Caller sounds composed, not panicking. When asked if she was safe, Romy responded, "Yes, he's still in the guest house." "Not I think. Not maybe. He is." The dispatcher asked who. Romy replied, "My brother, Nick Reiner, the silent witness." Police arrived at 8:16 p.m. By then, Romy was outside. She led officers to the guest house. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Eventually, Nick opened the door. Slowly. According to the report, he looked dazed but not distressed. Officers entered. No signs of blood. No cuts. No visible injuries. He was wearing sweatpants. Barefoot. A hoodie. There was a half-eaten sandwich on the table and Pulp Fiction playing on the TV. They asked if he'd heard anything. He said, "No, I had my headphones in." But when they checked, there were no headphones. The questions start mounting. Why didn't Nick respond to Romy's calls or the doorbell? Why did he say he had headphones in when he didn't? Why didn't he call 911? And perhaps most damning, why didn't he ask if his parents were alive? Officers recall he showed no urgency, no questions, no visible shock. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't confused. He was waiting. And when they asked him where he'd been all evening, his answer? Here. No alibi. No defense. Just here. The forensic slip. Blood spatter analysis is a tricky science. But one thing is certain. Whoever killed Rob and Michelle cleaned up. The killer left no trail. No bloody footprints. No transfer stains. No discarded gloves. But what the killer didn't account for was luminol. Inside the guest house, specifically in the bathroom, traces of blood were found beneath the sink basin. Diluted. Scrubbed. But there. DNA matched Rob. And even more alarming, tiny fibers from the same rug where Rob's body was found were embedded in the guest house bathroom drain. How does a hallway rug end up in the guest house sink? The answer isn't accidental. It's transport. Nick's statement. In his initial interview, Nick repeated one phrase multiple times. "I didn't see anything." Not, "I didn't do anything." "I didn't see anything." It's subtle, but telling. It implies proximity. It implies knowledge, not ignorance. And when asked if he had any issues with his parents recently, Nick paused, then said, "We had differences, but nothing like this. Like this." He didn't deny being angry. He didn't deny resentment. He just deflected, and that only deepened suspicion. The mother's final message. There's something else. Something the public was never supposed to know. Michelle Reiner had a habit of keeping digital notes, shopping lists, birthday plans, thoughts, and on the night of her death, at 6:42 p.m., she opened her notes app. The file was titled, "If Anything Happens." She never hit save. She never got to finish it. But the first sentence? "We made a mistake bringing him back." Investigators believe she meant Nick. That line was time-stamped 4 minutes before the scream. Meaning, she knew. She felt it. And she didn't have time to warn anyone. The brutal irony. Rob Reiner spent his life creating fictional justice. Courtroom dramas. Stories where the guilty are punished. The innocent are heard. Truth wins. But in his final hours, inside his own home, truth hid in silence. No cameras. No witnesses. No time. Just blood. And someone watching Pulp Fiction next door. One final detail, the light. Remember the flickering lights? Outdoor sensors captured a brief power interruption at 6:47 p.m., the same minute the scream was heard. Experts later confirmed the fuse box showed signs of tampering. That's not random. That's a prelude. Kill the lights. Kill the cameras. Then kill the couple. And leave no trace. Except one. Romy. And the name she whispered to officers as they took her statement. It was him. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She didn't even cry. Romy Reiner walked into a murder scene, stepped over blood, stared at her father's body, and calmly told the 911 dispatcher, "My brother's in the guest house." But it wasn't just what she said that sent chills through the station. It was what she whispered later, off the record, to a single detective behind a closed door. Because Romy didn't just discover the bodies. She had seen the collapse coming. And now she was ready to talk. The daughter in the background. Romy Reiner was never a tabloid figure. No scandals. No DUIs. No dramatic breakups. She dabbled in stand-up, wrote short scripts, occasionally posted satire videos online. Her online presence was quirky, artistic, under the radar. To most people, she was just Rob Reiner's daughter. To those who knew her well, she was a quiet observer, the one who watched while the family fell apart. And when everything finally exploded on that brutal Sunday night in Brentwood, she wasn't surprised. Not really, because Romy had been documenting things for months. The visit that changed everything. 2 weeks before the murders, Romy flew home unexpectedly from New York. She'd told friends she felt uneasy, that she'd had a strange call with her mom, that something was off. What she didn't tell them, her mother had left her a voicemail, one she saved, one she played for investigators, one that started with, "Romy, if anything happens to us, you need to remember what we talked about." It was 32 seconds long. Michelle never specified a threat, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, frightened, resigned. That message changed Romy's plans. She packed her bags. She booked the flight. And she went home. What she found when she got there would haunt her forever. Behind closed doors. The first day back, Romy noticed something strange. Nick wouldn't speak to her. He didn't come out of the guest house. He didn't answer texts. He didn't even make eye contact when she passed him in the driveway. That wasn't new. What was new? Her parents' reaction. They were walking on eggshells, whispering behind doors, double-locking windows, checking cameras more than usual. At one point, she caught Michelle burning old photos in the fireplace. When Romy asked why, her mother just said, "Some things don't need to survive this year." A family fractured. Over the next week, Romy started keeping a journal. She documented her parents' erratic behavior, strange nighttime noises from the guest house, heated arguments behind closed doors, her father pacing the hallway at 3 a.m., her mother crying in the bathroom. She didn't know what it all meant, but she felt the tension crawling beneath the surface, especially around Nick. He was sullen, detached, but more than that, he was watching them. Cameras set up in his guest house, a laptop constantly recording, sticky notes on the fridge with cryptic phrases. "Freedom is painful. They made me this way. Silence is survival." Romy took pictures. She sent them to a friend, just in case. The night of the murders, Romy had planned to confront her parents that night. She'd been reviewing security camera footage on her own, and she found something chilling. On Thursday night, 3 days before the murders, Nick had entered the main house after midnight. He didn't know he was on camera. He wandered the halls, entered the kitchen, stopped outside the master bedroom. Then he did something inexplicable. He stood there for 8 minutes, silent, motionless, staring at the door, and then turned back and left. That footage never made it to police because the home server was burned, but Romy had already exported it to her phone. The interrogation room. After the bodies were found, Romy was taken to the station for questioning. Officers expected a sobbing mess. Instead, they got a steel-eyed young woman with a phone full of receipts. She showed them the voicemail from Michelle, screenshots of Nick's fridge notes, pictures of Nick's surveillance setup, the late-night hallway footage, a journal entry from the night before that read, "He's close to snapping. I don't know how much longer they can keep pretending." Detectives asked her point blank, "Do you think Nick could have done this?" Romy didn't blink. "Yes," she said. "Or worse. I think he already planned to." The secret conversation, what the public didn't know until now. Romy had confronted her mother the morning of the murders. They sat in the kitchen, just the two of them. And Michelle admitted something that never made it into any official police report. She believed Nick had relapsed, but not just with drugs, with rage. She said he'd been sleeping with a knife under his pillow, that he'd been visiting dangerous forums online, that he'd screamed at her during an argument. "You're not my real family." She told Romy she was considering moving out, but she never got the chance. The knife that didn't belong. One of the few physical clues at the crime scene, a paring knife, thin, sharp, slightly rusted, was found near Rob's body. It didn't match the kitchen set. It didn't have prints. It was unique. And when Romy saw it, she recognized it immediately. Nick's knife. She'd seen it in his drawer before. Even borrowed it once to cut a tag off her luggage. The hilt had a chipped corner, something you wouldn't notice unless you'd held it. That knife, Romy swore, came from the guest house. So how did it end up near her father's body? No signs of forced entry, but one door was unlocked. Investigators combed every lock, every hinge, every sensor. No forced entry, no broken alarms. But one side door, leading from the main house to the garden, had been left unlocked. Not kicked. Not picked. Unlatched. Only someone inside could have done that. Only someone who knew the house. Romy's final statement. Toward the end of her interrogation, Romy did something unusual. She asked to speak with a detective alone. No lawyers. No tape recorder. Just a notepad. She said, "I need you to understand something. My father wasn't scared of strangers. He was scared of someone closer." She paused, then added, "He left me something, and I haven't told anyone yet." She reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. Encrypted. She said Rob gave it to her months ago, after a fight with Nick. He'd said, "If anything happens, open this with someone you trust, and only when it's safe." The drive was handed over to detectives. Its contents? Still under lock and key, but sources say it contains audio recordings of private conversations, screenshots of internal emails, footage taken from inside the guest house, and a document labeled, "The Truth About Nick. Why didn't she speak sooner?" Romy later admitted she'd been scared, not just of Nick, but of what she might find. What if her father wasn't the man she thought he was? What if the secrets went deeper? What if this wasn't just about family, but about legacy? She waited. She watched. And when the blood hit the floor, she acted. And now? Now she wants the truth out. The quiet hero. She doesn't want the fame. She doesn't want the interviews. She just wants answers. She was the daughter pushed to the margins. Now she's the only one who can put the pieces together. Because what Rob and Michelle couldn't say out loud, Romy is saying in their silence. But what's on that flash drive could either seal Nick's fate or shatter Romy's version of the truth forever. They smiled on red carpets. They laughed at fundraisers. They posted family photos that seemed almost too perfect. But behind the closed doors of the Reiner estate, it was war, emotional silence, tight-lipped glances, and a sun spiraling toward the unthinkable. This chapter isn't about murder. It's about the years of pressure, pain, and secrets that made it possible. Because once you understand the Reiner family's inner breakdown, one question will gnaw at you. Were the murders a moment of madness, or the final chapter of a long-suppressed story? The Golden Father, and the son who couldn't compete. Rob Reiner was a giant. In Hollywood, in politics, in public discourse. But as a father, the picture wasn't as polished. Multiple friends of the family, speaking off-record, described Rob's relationship with Nick as strained, competitive, even detached. One said, Rob loved his son, but he didn't know how to love Nick as he was. Only as he could have been. That's a heavy thing to grow up with, especially when your father is always right on screen and in the press. Nick tried to emulate him. He wrote, he directed, he created, but nothing ever measured up. And soon, he stopped trying. The spiral of addiction and the collapse of trust. Nick's addiction issues weren't a secret to those close to the Reiners. There were stints in rehab, scattered public records of misdemeanor arrests, rumors of aggressive outbursts. Rob covered for him, again and again. He paid for treatment, paid for therapists, even brought Nick into writing projects, like Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical script about a young addict battling family pressure. But after the movie flopped, something changed. Nick withdrew. Rob distanced. And Michelle? She broke. Sources close to her say she confided in friends that she feared Nick was lost. One even recalled a haunting line Michelle once said over dinner. He's not who we raised. He's something else now. A sister caught in the middle. Romy often played peacemaker. She'd try to mediate calls between Nick and Rob. Try to defend Michelle's boundaries. Try to pull Nick out of his shell. But eventually, even she stepped back. According to one close friend of hers, Romy loved Nick, but she didn't trust him. And that line, once crossed, changed everything. One story stands out. At a family dinner 2 years ago, Nick reportedly lashed out, throwing a glass at the wall after Rob made a joke about him finally finishing something. The joke was about a screenplay. The moment became a metaphor. Shattered glass, shattered pride, shattered family. The private messages investigators recovered. When detectives searched the family's shared iCloud account, they found fragments of text conversations that painted a disturbing picture. Rob to Michelle, 6 months before the murder. I don't think I can help him anymore. Michelle to Rob, 3 weeks before. I feel unsafe with him here. Romy to her therapist, 1 week before. Something's coming. I can feel it. The energy in this house is wrong. Even more chilling were the unsent messages. Drafts. Notes. Voice memos never delivered. Next draft to Rob. You think you can control me, but you never really saw me. None of you did. Michelle's unsent note to Romy. If something happens, I want you to know I always believed you. What was Romy trying to convince her of? And why didn't she press harder? The money disputes that turned toxic. Behind every broken dynasty is a financial fracture. Rob Reiner's estate was worth millions. Reports suggest he'd been reviewing his will in the months leading up to his death. And that's where the tension turned radioactive. Nick was reportedly set to inherit a significantly smaller portion than Romy. Why? Family insiders say Rob had been quietly shifting financial assets into a charitable trust managed by Romy and Michelle. Nick, reportedly, wasn't informed. When he found out, he exploded. Multiple emails recovered between Nick and Rob's financial advisor show heated exchanges. One message, dated just 3 weeks before the murders, was flagged by investigators. Nick wrote, "This is how you treat your son? Keep playing God, old man. You'll see how that ends." A week later, Rob changed the security codes to the main house. The intervention, that backfired. One last event may have sealed the Reiners' fate. A week before the murders, Rob and Michelle staged what friends later referred to as an emotional confrontation. They sat Nick down. Voices were raised. Ultimatums were issued. Nick was told he had 30 days to find his own place. That Romy had discovered his online activity. That the knives were being locked up. Michelle allegedly told him, "I'm tired of fearing you in my own home. And Rob, we can't live like this. You need help where you need to go." Nick didn't respond. He stood. He left the room. And later that night, he punched a hole in the guest house wall. It was patched over the next morning. But not before Romy took a picture. The ghost in the guest house. Neighbors often saw Nick walking around late at night. In a hoodie, sometimes barefoot, talking to himself. Or not at all. One even reported seeing him just hours before the murders, standing alone at the property's fence line, staring at the main house. When asked what he was doing, Nick reportedly replied, "Waiting for the lights to go out." Creepy? Yes. Predictive? Maybe. And yet, no one did anything. Why? Because he was family. And that's the trap. The therapist who raised the alarm. Nick had been seeing a therapist up until 2 months before the murders. But after a session in early spring, the therapist allegedly sent a confidential advisory to the family's attorney. It wasn't a legal requirement, just a warning. It read, "I have growing concerns about Nick's emotional state. I believe he is struggling with deep-seated resentment, detachment from reality, and escalating ideation. He should not be left unsupervised." The letter was never followed up on. It was filed, ignored, and then buried. The family that knew, but couldn't escape. By the time Romy arrived that weekend, everyone knew the house was a pressure cooker. Rob had spent decades fighting monsters on screen, but he didn't know how to handle the one in his own home. Michelle saw the signs. Romy felt the shift. Nick slipped further. And still, no one left. Because that's what families do. They stay. They try. They hope. Until it's too late. And when the lights went out that night, one family's secrets exploded into blood. Once hailed as the heir to a Hollywood throne, now sitting in a concrete cell, staring into a silence even his family couldn't bear. How does a son go from being a celebrated screenwriter to the prime suspect in the murder of his own parents? This isn't a story about rebellion. It's a story about erosion, of identity, of mental health, of love turned into bitterness, and bitterness turned into something far more dangerous. Nick Reiner's fall wasn't a crash. It was a slow, silent, spiraling descent, and it ended with 2 bodies on the floor. The child of a legend. From the outside, Nick Reiner had it all. Born into Hollywood royalty, surrounded by icons, given every opportunity to shine. He appeared in photos alongside stars. His name opened doors before he even knocked. He could pitch a film in the morning and have a meeting by lunch. But here's what most people didn't see. He hated it. Nick once confided to a friend, "I was born into a script I didn't write. That script was suffocating. Every move compared to his father. Every line judged next to Rob's legendary wit. Every achievement dismissed as inherited. He didn't feel like a person. He felt like a prop. And resentment grew quietly, like rust under paint. A brief spark of hope. In 2016, Nick co-wrote Being Charlie, a raw, semi-autobiographical film about addiction, privilege, and pain. Rob directed it. It was their reconciliation project. Critics were intrigued. Some praised its honesty. Others panned it for being too close to home. But one